I think it is entirely possible, credibly possible, that we are going to have a renaissance in our democratic republic. I think that we are, and many of other people have observed this, is that we are in a cycle that feels very similar to about 100 years ago, when, I think the levers of government were fundamentally broken and corrupt. I think that income inequality had also exploded. There were a myriad of problems that were not being addressed by anyone, and the democratic processes had been corrupted very badly. And I think that spawned a renaissance, and it is entirely credibly possible, if there's enough people who are willing to be brave and be leaders, that we can have that renaissance coming out of the moment that we're in. And I think if you want to imagine what that renaissance looks like, I think it is a shift to, instead of first past the post and single member districts, it is a shift in our legislatures, both at the state and the federal level. It is a shift towards what's called proportional representation or multi-member districts. So what this means is, if you imagine like one of those big giant rectangular states out west, let's say that state has 12 Congress members. This is a made-up state.
Right.
Let's say the state has 12 Congress members. Right now, each of those Congress members is elected from a different district, and those districts are brutally gerrymandered. And now with Calais, they can be gerrymandered racially.
Welcome to another episode of The Tradeoff. I'm your host, Roslyn Smith. One of the things I love the most about this show is that we get to go beyond the headlines. We spend so much time talking about systems, government, technology, institutions, but we don't always stop to talk about the people working behind the scenes to make those systems function. Few institutions are more important or more scrutinized than our elections. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or someone who's simply trying to make sense of today's political environment, one thing should unite us all: confidence that our elections are secure, fair, and worthy of public trust. That's become increasingly difficult in an era where misinformation spreads in seconds, cybersecurity threats continue to evolve, and election workers have found themselves under unprecedented pressure. But while most of us only think about elections every 2 or 4 years, there are people who dedicate their careers to protecting the integrity of our democratic process every single day. Today's guest is one of those people. Quinn Raymond has spent his career at the intersection of technology, public service, and democracy. Through his work with VoteShield, he collaborates with election officials, technology experts, and law enforcement partners to help identify threats, strengthen election infrastructure, and support the people responsible for administering elections across the country. But this conversation isn't just about cybersecurity, it's about leadership, it's about collaboration, it's about how trust is built, and it's about how it can be rebuilt when confidence has been shaken. Quinn, welcome to The Tradeoff. It's great to have you.
Roslyn, it's always so nice to see you. Thank you for having me. And I should start by just giving the caveat of I'm here in my own personal capacity, and any viewpoints I express are my own and not those of any organization or other thing that I'm a part of. Did that sound legal? That sounded legal, right?
That definitely passes the smell test. And you know what? Since we're at it, I'd like to say that as well as we delve into this conversation. So before we get into election security, just tell us more about your journey. What made you get into public service? Like, was this always a part of the plan? And what first fascinated you about technology?
So I grew up on the Lower East Side / East Village back in the bad old days of the 80s. And I grew up in a fairly chaotic time in our city. And, I think that as I was growing up, I realized that technology could be an opportunity for me to get out of that world that I was in. And I very successfully lobbied my mom to get me a desktop computer in 1994. which was a 486 DX33 with 4 megabytes of RAM running Windows 3.1, which is a long-winded way of saying it could basically type, and that was about it. But I think that box became a portal for me to get out of where I was. And I understood the transformative power of technology. And I think at that point, I had more of a utopian view of what that meant. I think since then, in my older, wiser years, I realized that that's a double-edged sword, and have tried to recalibrate that. But basically, I've had a very non-linear career, which I think has actually been very beneficial because I've been able to take a lot of different threads and synthesize them into hopefully some things that are useful for our democracy. So I started Vote Shield in 2017 after the 2016 elections, where there was evidence that a foreign power had actually hacked into our voter databases. They did not make any changes to our voter databases. They simply stole that data of those, voters' records. But I think that was certainly a wake-up call for a huge Achilles heel in our election system. Most of our election system, thankfully, these days is run by paper, which is a good thing. It is very hard to run voter registration systems with paper in a country of our size. So we need additional systems to make sure it's secure. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure I answered the question.
No, I think you did, because sometimes our careers choose us as much as we choose them. And I think in the case of technology or anything that interfaces with technology in the era that we're in, right? Some of the roles that we see today did not exist 20 years ago. It ends up being a confluence of different things we've picked up as we navigate various industries and roles, and it ends up like just coming together. I can say that for myself, now working in the ad tech space and doing programmatic ads after having roles as a digital product owner, doing voice of client and UX and those type of things. What actually is election security? Like, help us demystify what that means.
So I think at the most basic level, a free and fair election requires many things, but one of the things it requires is just a sound process to ensure that the person who got the most votes, in fact, wins the election. And that can mean a lot of different things, but you want to make sure that the system is free. Any interference that might change that outcome. And so, we want to ensure that the processes are sound. And I think, especially these days, we want to ensure that the public also can have confidence in elections. And I think the biggest challenge to that is that the main driver of concerns about elections comes from losing candidates. And, there's always there's a really interesting dynamic in this, Roslyn, is that there's always a sore loser phenomenon. If your side lost the election, there's always going to be a percent of your voters who think that it was unfair, that you were cheated in some way. People use the term rigged a lot, which is like one of the vaguest verbs you can possibly conjure. And I think what we've realized in recent years is that when a losing candidate insists that they were cheated without any evidence, a lot more of your supporters are going to believe that the election was rigged. And so that is the sort of crisis that we're working through now, is that you need the loser to acknowledge and concede that they lost. And there are examples across the political spectrum of sore losers, and in primaries, and certainly we've seen in presidential elections. So, I would say that, I think of election security now much more expansively than I would have when we started this work, which is you need to be certain of the winner. You need to be certain that the process was clean. And you also need to find ways to prevail upon losers to accept that they're losers.
So, and help us distinguish something, right? Because when you say sore loser in an environment where there's also a perception that there are foreign interests in our election, are those two things working in collaboration, or are they separate? Are those two separate things working concurrently?
I think it's worth accepting that, especially for a country of our size and power, that there will always be foreign interests who are interested in interfering with our elections because, to quote De La Soul, stakes is high, right? Like whoever runs our country doesn't just run our country. They have a profound impact on the rest of the world. And of course, the US has a long history of interfering in other people's elections going back many centuries. And that is, of course, always wrong in any direction. And I think that it becomes a question of scale, right? And so, I think that, foreign interference at this point, especially because the world is just completely immersed in conflict right now, is to be expected and is also very unfortunate. I think that the question is always like, what is the degree of that interference? And is that actually changing the outcome of elections? And if so, how? I don't know if that answers the question. I keep asking you that, but I feel like we have an onion and we're like, peeling the layers off and like it can get increasingly complex. But I guess the bottom line is it is completely reasonable to expect that there will be foreign interests who are trying to interfere with our elections, be it with campaign dollars, be it with disinformation campaigns online, and also attempts to hack our systems. And I'll say, thankfully, because again, most of our systems are actually paper, it is exceptionally hard to hack the actual outcome of the election. You can hack people's perception of the outcome of the election.
So I'm really glad that you said that. So as we're thinking about this onion and we're peeling it and potentially coming in, with a cutting board and starting to get into this place where we're able to slice and dice it.
This metaphor sounds delicious. Can we get
It
some tomato?
does. It does. Even
Any
though
garlic peppers we can.
it's a hot day in July and I'm cooking nothing. If anything, the most I'm making today is a smoothie, okay? So, so how much of election security really is technology versus people when we think about the fact that we have these foreign interests and then we have the sore loser phenomenon?
So both matter. Sorry, that's a wishy-washy answer, but unfortunately it's the truth. So on the technology side, right, the foremost experts on this are Verified Voting. And you can go to Verified Voting's website. If you are feeling extra wonky, you can go on their website. You can see the exact systems that are used in your county and see how elections work in your county, every system that is used. And the bottom line is that paper ballots are the most trustworthy. And there's a principle in all of this, which is you want software independent verification of the election. So software independence is a concept, which is basically starts with the premise that any machine or piece of software inevitably eventually will become hacked. And I think we are especially concerned about that now with the evolution of artificial intelligence, mythos, things like that. So assume as the default that every system can be in one way or another hacked. Once you have that, you then need to have some process that it does not involve computers or software to ensure that the computers and software are functioning correctly. And so that's where risk limiting audits come in. And so a risk limiting audit is a very different thing than some of the like fraudulent audits or fraudits that came up after 2020, where there were people who had no idea what they were doing and they just started rummaging around and looking at ballots without any understanding of the process or, the expectations of how that was supposed to work. So basically, the software and the processes and the systems, the technology all need to work together in a way so that you can say that the machines, which can count very, very quickly, right? Like they're going to tell you the result. And then you're going to have human beings who are cross-partisan, who are going to examine and audit those results selectively in a very, like fast and efficient way to make sure that the machine is telling you the truth. So that's like the technology piece and process piece of it at the high level. And then there's the perception piece. And that, unfortunately, because of our media landscape now, is actually a much harder nut to crack. There are fewer obvious solutions to that problem. Again, especially when you have media platforms that are controlled by candidates or candidates who are especially obstinate in their worldview that they've been cheated.
So it seems like it's not the biggest challenge really is public confidence more than anything else. So how do we combat misinformation?
So that is a big topic, and it's not one that I have a ton of expertise in, to be
Mhm.
honest. I would say prayer is good, but
Okay.
no,
Well, that's a start. Yeah, I mean, that's not a bad start for a lot of things.
But, I think that a huge part of it is being willing to have direct conversations with people outside of our bubbles. And this is especially one of these examples where I need to say that this is my own opinion. I think as someone who worshiped at the altar of social media for a very long time, and I think probably if I do the math, committed a good 10% of my life to being eternally online. Like, I think that the social media platforms as they exist today are, going back to the beginning of the introduction, are, in terms of double-edged swords, are like just a negative. And I think people can point to like some very specific examples of like, oh, I get to see my cousin's kid, or oh, I need, whatever, I need to know what's going on. And like, I think that that devolves very quickly, as with cable news, into political hobbyism as opposed to actual political activism. And so, because these platforms are controlled by a very small number of people, they can shape our perceived realities. And that is a tremendous vulnerability in our democracy because there is no objective truth anymore. And, I think until we solve that problem, I think that the natural solution is to divest from social media in every sense. And, we are social media's product. And the more we feed it, the wealthier those people become. And also, like, the less control we have, right? I think about all of these influencers online who have built followings with millions of people and have, they work 60, 70 hours a week to produce content. And ultimately, they own nothing. And if the algorithm is tweaked even slightly, right, they are penniless. And so I think that, this entire system of how social media is owned, how it is controlled, it is completely unregulated in any reasonable sense in our country. Like, all of those things create a perfect environment for mis and disinformation. Misinformation being people who are in good faith saying the wrong thing, disinformation being liars.
Wow, that is such a profound statement. And my mind goes to just different things we've seen on social media and what I've seen in civic spaces where there has been encouragement for people to create counter narratives, right? You don't really have a good team unless you have someone pumping out content to push whatever narrative that organization is working towards. Like it's kind of become the battle of narratives. And to your point, the objective truth gets buried in this ocean of everyone fighting to be heard, in these algorithms. And then for someone like myself, in the ad tech space where there is a use of data and targeting and spending to specifically kind of cut through the algorithm and reach people, that's a whole nother can of worms. How do we preserve our humanity in all of
I think we need to spend more time with each other. And I think we need to spend more time with people outside of our immediate circle. I think even here in New York City, right? It's like you can walk 5 blocks and be in a completely different neighborhood with a completely different culture, and everything changes. And we often, even in our city, stay in our bubbles. And I think that that is much to the detriment of New York City. And so that's not really a how, it's just a sort of, this is sort of, I think, a natural human. We get into our little tribes and that's it. But the nice thing I will say about ad tech, and the nice thing I will say about social media, and this is sincere, and I told this to my friend who has been at Meta since before it went public, right? And, like we are very much at odds on this topic. But I said, before I canceled before I deleted my Facebook and my Instagram and my X and all of that other stuff, and never signed up for Blue Sky. That's what
Blue
it's called, right?
Sky?
I sound like such an old man.
Boy, you're resisting the machine.
The thing I said to him, which is true, is that the thing that Instagram was so good at for me was finding things that I wanted to buy. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The advertising on those platforms is so incredibly precise. I didn't know I needed this t-shirt, but I did. And they knew that I needed this t-shirt, and then I bought the t-shirt. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. It was still my choice. It's not like they manipulated me into buying it. They were just like, hey, you really want this? And I was like, damn, Mark Zuckerberg's right. I really do want that t-shirt.
But I think there's some psychology behind that. And as an ad tech person, right, there are best practices around how many times someone has to be hit with either the same messaging or the same ad before they convert or take what we would call the desired action. So whether it's buying the t-shirt or is it submitting your vote by mail ballot, whatever that particular, use case is. So I think there's something to be said about the art of influence in our modern digital age and how social media plays a role in moving people, right? And to your point, I think there are some net positives. When I reflect on things like George Floyd, I think for communities where maybe there were things said over time about excess use of force with law enforcement and people thinking, oh, it's hyperbole. It didn't happen that way. And then, there's now this video on social media and everyone sees and it's like, oh, wow, it did happen that way and it's been happening that way. Okay, now we see the truth. So, there's net positive. There's also been a lot of negative, and hopefully somewhere in the middle we'll eventually arrive there, because to your point about it not really being regulated, I think legislators are doing their best to catch up, but then again, they're behind on a lot of things. So I don't know if they can catch up with that. And then we haven't even touched on AI. So I think AI
Yeah,
is just sailing away. But let's bring it back to election security, because I know that you have worked with other organizations, and I think I even brought up law enforcement in another context. But in this context, as it relates to election security, they've been helpful and impactful in terms of making sure we have confidence in our elections. Can you describe more about that work?
absolutely. And I'll say, I spent a lot of time thinking about cybersecurity, right? But you cannot have a free and fair election without physical security. And unfortunately, it has become more and more relevant in recent years. So we've seen a massive spike since 2020 of threats directed at election workers. And I work with those people firsthand. And I have heard their stories about having to flee their houses with their family due to credible threats. I am aware that some of them have purchased firearms. I am aware of the kinds of things that are said to them. Most election workers tend to be women. And so there's a lot of sexualized threats. There's a lot of sexualized threats towards people's families. We don't have to get too deep into it, but it's really much worse than I think most people realize. And it has taken a toll. And you see that toll in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways you see is in the massive attrition rate of people saying, you know what, I've been doing this for 25 years and I'm done. It's time to retire to Florida. I can't do this anymore. And that brain drain is further eroding our ability to run excellent elections. And it makes it harder for voters to be able to vote because, unfortunately, the people who are running that election are relatively, in many places, inexperienced. It might be their first election and they don't have the benefit of that 25 years of experience. So, this aspect is a problem, right? And there are other countries in the world where the physical security transcends from threats into death, into violence, into bombing poll sites, into assassinating people. It can get much, much worse than it is right now in the US. And so one of the most important pieces of this puzzle is better coordination between election officials and law enforcement. And so the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections was founded under the premise that those folks need to talk to each other more. And it is true that as a general rule, it is, I think a good principle for communities to say we keep ourselves safe. And I think that that makes sense in most contexts. I think that if an election is under threat, if there is someone who's shown up to the poll site with a firearm, with bad intent, you need to call the cops. And the
Right.
cops need to know what to do. And we've had a massive wave of bomb threats, which clear the poll site in many instances. They shouldn't have to, but because we have not prepared for this, the poll site is cleared, it's shut down. You lose hours of voting because the poll site is shut down, right? It's incredible. It is the equivalent in cyber land is it's a distributed denial of service attack. Basically, you've created sort of just this wave of information that floods a resource and makes the resource unusable. And so election officials are learning how to adapt to bomb threats, but it requires coordination with law enforcement. It requires bomb sniffing dogs who are adorable and also incredibly good at ensuring that a poll site stays open, right? So, like, I think we have to hold both of those truths, right? Is that it is true that there are communities that are over policed. It is true that there is a history of white supremacy and violence that has plagued our country since its origin. It is also true that if you want to run a safe and secure election, you do need guys with guns, and you do need for them to be trained, and you need them to understand what they need to do to make sure that that election is safe. So balancing that is hard and also necessary. And so the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections has done incredible work working with sheriffs and police departments across the country, learning from them, understanding, how they see things, understanding, their processes, and their tremendous expertise over many decades, and it has been quite beneficial. And we've seen in the data that the number of election administrators who are coordinating with law enforcement has increased dramatically, which has good results and makes our elections free and more fair.
Wow. Well, I'm struggling to identify a time in US history where the threats that you have described were as prevalent as they are today. Would you say that these are unprecedented times that we're living through?
I mean, I think what makes them unprecedented. So if you go back and read how elections went down, like, oh my God, just like the Jim Crow piece alone is
Okay.
like, it is so insane that this is the history of our country. And I know a lot of people are trying to erase that history or just sort of, like obfuscate it. But we have been in very scary situations for a long time historically as a country related to elections. We've had genuine chaos. There is an ebb and flow of eras that make things better or worse. And the thing that is different now is the same problem that I think faces our entire civilization now, which is there's this problem of asymmetry. So my super no, not brainy, my super like overthought thesis is that the main problem of the 21st century is asymmetry. There is an imbalance. And the imbalance with technology is that you can have a very small number of people, right, do amazing things, but also wreak havoc. You can have, and you see this in our Gini coefficient with income inequality, right? You have more and more a very, very tiny percent of people who have all of the wealth. That imbalance, that asymmetry is destabilizing our country and our world and leading to, some fairly dangerous populism. And you see it in technology. You see it in all of these other ways where a very small number of people can have a very big impact around them. And, when that is some committed organizers who are trying to improve their community, that's amazing. When it is, a guy with an AR-15 or a drone with a payload, that is terrifying. And so I think it comes back to this problem of asymmetry.
And so when you reflect on the asymmetry, and as you were talking, I thought about the fact that we're transitioning into like this multipolar world, right? And kind of a new world order and hierarchy kind of being shooken up. What has this work taught you about leadership?
Stay as far away from it as possible is what it's taught me. Keep your head down.
Run! Run! Oh my goodness. Run for the hills, everyone.
Listen, Rosalind, genetically speaking, there's a reason you and me have made it this far. Our ancestors from time to time just knew when to keep their head down.
But I know we're laughing, but there's a lot of truth. There's so much truth in what you're saying. There is a time to kind of like see where the chips fall and then determine what your next steps are going to be.
Yeah. And I'll say, actually, this is not the time for that. This is the time for everyone to find their courage. And I'm joking. I just want to be clear. I'm joking, but like, this is my gallows humor. This is how a lot of people in this space tend to process the chaos that we're in. But, I think I have seen very brave leadership modeled And again, it comes back to election administrators. It comes back to law enforcement officers, within that community, right? There's a variety of viewpoints, some of which I think are pretty hostile towards democracy. And so you see these examples of people who are entrusted with power, who are willing to do hard things, and it makes it easier for us to do hard things. And so that is the biggest thing I've learned is that, I think good leadership is modeled, and it is helpful for me to always maintain that perspective of seeing the other brave things that people have done in this space. It makes it easier to do this work and show up.
And let me ask you this, when if you were to take the most optimistic viewpoint of where we're headed, what might that look like going forward in terms of our democracy?
I think it is entirely possible, credibly possible, that we are going to have a renaissance in our democratic republic. I think that we are, and many of other people have observed this, is that we are in a cycle that feels very similar to about 100 years ago when, I think the levers of government were fundamentally broken and corrupt. I think that income inequality had already also exploded. There were a myriad of problems that were not being addressed by anyone, and the democratic processes had been corrupted very badly. And I think that that spawned a renaissance, and it is entirely credibly possible if there's enough people who are willing to be brave and be leaders that we can have that renaissance coming out of the moment that we're in. And I think if you want to imagine what that renaissance looks like, I think it is a shift to instead of first past the post and single member districts, it is a shift in our legislatures, both at the state and the federal level. It is a shift towards what's called proportional representation or multi-member districts. So what this means is if you imagine like one of those big giant rectangular states out west, let's say that that state has 12 Congress members. This is a made up state. And let's
Right.
say the state has 12 Congress members. Right now, each of those Congress members is elected from a different district, and those districts are brutally gerrymandered. And now with Calais, they can be gerrymandered racially as well, which is disenfranchising huge numbers of people. And in any one of those districts, right, you can have a ton of people who do not believe in the same things as the person who's been elected to represent them in Congress. And that cuts both ways. It cuts left and it cuts right and it cuts center. And again, like to your point about a multipolar world, right? Two parties is really not adequate to describe the vast diversity of American political views. And so what multi-member districts would enable is imagine these 12 single member districts consolidated into, say, 4 multi-member districts with 3 Congress members each. So now imagine that this big rectangle had been divided into 4 smaller rectangles, and each of those small rectangles had 3 members of Congress. And what that would mean is that those members of Congress could actually represent the vast majority of the people in that area. It would also mean that gerrymandering would be all but impossible. It would be too hard to slice and dice that up in a way that would advantage one political interest over another. And so I think there are other countries who use this system for their legislatures, and it does work better. It also means you're going to get a wider diversity of political views, some of which are going to be very troubling to people. You will have a white nationalist party. You will have probably, very radical, actual true communists at some point percolate. You're going to have like a lot more diversity, and people are going to have to become comfortable with that diversity. But it also means that you're going to have everyone in this country adequately represented in ways that are proportional to that belief in the population. I don't know. Did that? I have been struggling to explain proportional representation for a few years. Did it make sense?
It made so much sense, and I think it's resonant with some of the trends that we've seen come out of the most recent, primary results as we look at what occurred in New York last week, and then we look at what occurred in Colorado last night, or not last night, 2 nights ago, so I definitely I'm inclined to agree with you, Quinn. I have a lot of confidence in the American people and that we will evolve, right? And that we will find a model that that works for the era that we're in, where, it's more of a government that is for the people. And I'm encouraged when I come across individuals like yourself that are dedicated to this work and the proliferation of ideas that drive the conversation to help us think more expansively about our democracy. And so I'm curious, as we're coming to a close, as you think about just trade-offs that you have made personally to do this work. I would love to hear that. And then for us as maybe an American people, what trade-offs we would have to make to kind of move forward to say, you know what, the system is not working. What do we have to give up in order to have more adequate representation? What do we have to let go of? And I don't mean the technical, like we know that, from a legislative perspective, we're going to have to evolve and do some things, to make amendments and so forth. But I think from an ideological standpoint, what trade-offs do we have to make to progress ourselves?
I love the way you frame this question. And I'll say, honestly, this has been selfish for me. I really have fun and enjoy this work. And if I didn't, A, I wouldn't be good at it. And B, I wouldn't have lasted as long as I have. So it is the joy of this work and of trying to solve some of these problems with much smarter people than me that has kept me going. And I think will continue to sustain me. So I think, it's not, travel is not great. Like I spend less time with my kid because, I have to go and meet with people all over the country and that, takes its toll, right? Air travel is not what it once was. So, I don't think that's great. That is a small quibble compared to the joys and benefits of the work. I think on an individual level, the average citizen, the things I would ask them to do, number one, is to accept that living in a country with 340 million people means that it is impossible for us to agree on lots of stuff. Like there's going to be so many things that we disagree on, really different values. We come from different backgrounds. We live in vastly different environments. And so I think the first thing that is required is some acceptance that like the bubble that is served to us on social media does not represent our country. And it is a much bigger, weirder, wilder place. And, we can either work this out in our capitals or we can work it out on battlefields, right? Like those are the options. And like we already had a civil war and it was not great. And so it means figuring out ways to govern ourselves better. And that means that citizens on an individual level need to, I think, be a lot more tolerant and accepting that people are not going to necessarily always see things their way. And I think related to that
Yes.
is,
Excuse me.
bless you,
Thank you.
is like having those conversations and finding the common points. And the thing that's funny is if you look at polling, moderates love to talk about this. I'm not a moderate, but moderates love to talk about this all the time. So if you look at polling for any of these big contested issues in the discourse, they're not contested at all. The overwhelming majority of Americans think there should be some form of voter ID. The reality is, I can tell you that like voter ID does not dramatically improve election security, but it does improve the perception of election integrity. And so if you design that law in a way that is not necessarily partisan or harmful to some communities, you can have a good outcome, right? And we see voter ID laws all across the country, and some of them are incredibly cynical and hateful, frankly, and designed to put the thumb on the scale. And others are, pretty chill, like show up with a water bill, whatever, like just like show us that you are who you say you are. Show up with a student ID, whatever. And so another example is gun control, right? And background checks and things like that. There's all of these things, right? And I'm not taking a position on any of those things, but I am saying that like overwhelmingly, if you look at the data on all of these hot button issues, abortion, gun control, voter ID, all of this stuff, they're not actually that controversial. We've just designed a political system that is intentionally frozen,
Polarizing, right?
polarizing, and designed to pit us against each other. And we can work, and immigration is like an incredible example of this, right? You could have had some completely reasonable immigration reforms decades ago, And that won't happen because the game theory doesn't work out for the two parties to ever agree on that. And the moment they become close, someone will put their own power and their own interest ahead of ensuring that that happens. And the people who suffer are all of us because of that. And I think that I want to keep coming back to that, right? Is this system of governance that we have is not actually working for us. It has terrible negative externalities that are harming our long-term future. And until we fix how we run, like, and I mean fix in the positive sense, like
Right.
fix how we run things and learn how to govern ourselves, we are going to continue to fall behind the rest of.
Wow, wow, wow. Well, Quinn, I really, really just thank you so much for all that you have contributed to the space and to today's conversation. I think it reminds us all that, democracy simply is not something that exists on its own. It's something that we have to continuously work on. For anyone who's listening and they want to reach out to you, how can they go about doing that?
Not social media.
I was thinking, I was like, well, you deleted X. You're not on Blue Sky. There's no Facebook. My goodness. Are you on LinkedIn?
Friendster, well, no, MySpace is no. I would say LinkedIn is good for professional contacts. I would also say that if people are just more broadly interested in our democracy and how to improve it, if you Google how you can protect democracy, if you search for how you can protect democracy, you can find Protect Democracy's list of all of the different things that you can do. And you can filter them by how much time they take. So if you have 2 minutes, you can look at the things that you can do in 2 minutes. If you have 5 years, you can look at the things that take 5 years to do. But like you can find a thing that is right sized for you in terms of how involved you want to get. You can also subscribe to Protect Democracy's Substack, which is called If You Can Keep It. And if you want to really sort of like follow the play by play of how our democracy is doing, that's a good place to check.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I hope that you have a wonderful fourth. And isn't it interesting that this conversation is falling on our 250th year anniversary? Like we did not plan this, Quinn. It just coincidentally we kind of fell into this, right? It just
But we
happened
don't
that
look a
way.
day over 100. So I think we're looking good. But
Yeah, I think so too. I think so. Well, thank you. Have a safe and happy holiday in this heat wave, okay?
you too, please stay cool. And thank you so much for having me. I really genuinely enjoyed this, Rosalind. It's always nice to see you.
Likewise, take care.
Take care.
Bye.